I want to ask you the question. You've been in South Africa, you went to the Bulls, you had some time in Pretoria, you spent some time with the
Mm.
players and coaches. What do you think makes the Bulls or the way that they play rugby different to any other union in South Africa? You know, what makes them different?
I'm returning to rugby for my current research, which we can talk about later. So I took about 10 years off from thinking about rugby. And I was like, over that time, I was like, maybe I exaggerated it a little bit, get a little anxious about like whether you found a narrative and just ran away with it. And then I was going back to my field notes and I was like, no, I didn't exaggerate it. Not even, I could have actually, if anything, I underplayed it. Like their
Yeah,
coaches are like, we want you to be like machines. We want you to be dominant. We want you to face, not space, right? We don't want you to play to space. We want you to smash and then have other people follow up and do extra phases and open up space by drawing in opponents, right? And like that, at least when I was doing my research, was something that coaches deliberately taught players, right? To the
yeah,
detriment of player creativity. Like I talked to players, particularly who came from the Western Cape, who are like, I don't know, I got all these things that I want to do on the field, and my coach just wants me to like run a switch, run a set of patterns. But the idea was
yeah.
that those patterns, if you do them perfectly, will march you down the field and get you territory, and then you can sort of like in a Python way, like constrict the other team into your success. I think that's a very particularly influential style among the Bulls, but I also think that like the Springboks have historically carried that style to the national team level too, right? I think I talked to a guy in the Western Cape who was like really annoyed actually that when players were introduced on the broadcast that they were described in terms of their height and weight. He was like, I don't care about their height and weight. I want to know how they can pass. I wonder if they can step, right? This is a mixed
I
race
want to see how they
mixed race
play.
guy.
Yeah,
I know, yeah. And so
yeah.
he was like, isn't it typical of like white South Afrikaner rugby that we get how big they are and we don't know whether they can pass? And like, you look at a guy like Pierce Spies or, Victor Matfield or
Oh my
like
God, that's the man. That's the
Osterrant
man.
or whatever. Those guys do like, don't ask them to offload in open play.
In the paper, I think some of the work you did in the book is sort of coming back and being utilized differently in the paper. But and again, to get back to sort of like the kind of question that, people would just ask you, which is that tension where the Bulls are doing this like mark-fast rugby. And I mean, growing up in South Africa, it was on television, like when you watch the Bulls, and it's in the book and in the paper, it comes through also, like it's associated with the police. I mean, the Bulls and the apartheid was basically the police and the army. Like that was who played in the Northern Transvaal team with Nas Puerta was a cop. Like these were cops. It's funny, making me think of like Louis, this guy. He had like a beard. He was one of their lock forwards under apartheid. His name will come back to me, but they were all cops. And so in your work, it's like that's their rugby. The interesting thing is, then you say like when a black player plays out of that style, then it's just magic. So I mean, it's like when I watch the Bulls even now, like, and I still watch, you can watch highlights because nowadays you can, in the US, you can just kind of, the highlights on YouTube, the
Mm-hmm.
games are on, like, I'm not going to give shout outs to streaming services here because they got to pay us first, but it's on streaming services. And what's interesting is like, that thing where you said the explanation they have for what people in maybe in the Western Cape just think is rugby,
Mm.
they call it magic. So like Kanan Moody, probably you know who Kanan Moody, the
Wow,
Springbok fullback
wow.
kind of
Mm.
winger, incredible player.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like it's from Paul, like black, whether he's self-identified as black or whether he's colored, but it's like how they explain that kind of energy in a team like that. Whereas I think the Stormers, for everything you want to say about them, is trying to do this other kind of rugby that you're describing that people associate with the Western Cape. And just to finish my point, so when people look at, say, the Springbok team, I feel that tension is always in the Springbok team. If the Springbok team, to my mind, doesn't do well, then they want to revert back to Mark Fuss and massively big white dudes. If they didn't do well, they blame this. I mean, this is like, if you're on the social media, if you're in the chat rooms or the Facebook comments of SA Rugby or whatever, it's Mani Lebok's fault. Those players are too short. They're playing too loose. We need to go back to basics. And so after they lost to the Wallabies, to Australia in the first test recently, they went back to a mostly white team. I mean, I saw people on social media reacting and going like, hold up. what is this team picture that we're seeing again? And then the rugby came. If you watch that second test, that I think they barely won, but they won it. It seemed with that Marquas rugby. So
Yeah.
that tension, as you're saying, it's not just 15 people, Rainbow Nation on the field, is it Afrikaner nationalism, but it's playing out in other kinds of ways.
Yeah.
In what you're watching, like anybody who knows South African rugby is watching it and kind of making those connections. I mean, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree. Like a friend sent me a clip. So I've been working on another project, and so I'm not as tapped into like test rugby as I'd like to be. Certainly not in like provincial rugby in South Africa as I'd like to be. A friend sent me a clip of a recent test that I actually happened to miss, where like off the base of a ruck, the scrum half tossed it up and they mauled. The Springboks mauled off a ruck. And I was like, no,
like a fake. You're talking about the fake line out?
Yeah, but like off in live play, they formed a maul in live play rather than off a line out. And like I was like, of course, what could be more like warm the heart of like an Afrikaner like rugby fan than watching a maul just happen rather than in a line out, you know? And like I think it keeps being true. And like that return, I think, is exactly right. That like if certain influential people in the institution of South African rugby feel like we're playing too loose, we're playing with too much chance, we're too unpredictable, whatever, our performance isn't matching our aspirations, let's retrench, right, to the kind of rugby that like we know, what they define as like proper South African rugby, the rugby that they can count on.